everyone. Welcome back to Behind the Mask. I'm EJ, one of your co-hosts, and with me today is T. Lori's unable to join us, but she'll be back in upcoming episodes. This is episode 32 that we're calling The Masks of the Healthcare System. Just a friendly reminder that anything discussed in this podcast is not to be used as a diagnosis or a replacement for conversations with your own doctors, therapists, psychologists, or other medical professionals. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about the masks of the healthcare system. And while there are a lot of great healthcare system things, there's also a lot of problems in the healthcare system. And there's a lack of advocacy by some medical professionals for the entire family in regards to a patient and care. And I'm going to let Tina talk a little bit about the situation that kind of brought up this topic, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Thanks, EJ. So recently a situation came up in my family. A little backstory is my mom has been in a long-term relationship with a gentleman who has been, in my opinion, what would be considered domestic violence. And I'm not going to go into all the details of that because that's my mom's story. That's my mom's circumstances. But the reason this is important is because recently he was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer, late stage, and stage cancer. Now, he has spent years living off my mom, even though he has his own place and he has his own income and all that. And he doesn't help in any way with that and expects her to do for him. And these are details that are recently coming out to me because my sister lives with them, and this is not something that they've shared. So that's part of why I'm quite frankly very angry about this whole situation, is because there's a lot of dynamics to it. So when he was diagnosed with the cancer, he took it on himself to assume that my mom would take care of him in this, and so, but kept telling her, if it's a burden, I won't stay, this and that. And then his health took a significant turn for the worse, and he ended up in the hospital. And they had given him just a very short period of time to live, and then pressured my mom. So his doctor and his social worker, that system, pressured my mom into taking him home and caring for him in her home. Now, she's 70 years old and still works and has her own health conditions. And she made it very clear this was not something she felt comfortable with, but they basically strong-armed her into doing that. And when hospice came in to get him set up, one of the nurses for the hospice agency even looked at my mom when she was expressing her concerns about this and looked at her and said, "You look strong enough, you can do this." And so now my mom works full time, takes care of this man who, even now in his sickness, uses that to, in my opinion, abuse her. He engages in very aggressive and poor behavior, like peeing all over the house and then blaming his illness. And so even when she expresses concerns about these things, and the social worker promised her that she would be available 24/7 if there were any issues. And recently there was an issue, and it took my mom more than a day to get a hold of the social worker to get some help and to get him up to the hospital. The hospital wouldn't even take him. So, because she couldn't get through to the doctor either. And these are people who promised her it wouldn't be like that. So, what's kind of come like for me in this situation is that the healthcare providers on his team found it too difficult to place him in a long-term care facility, and rather than deal with what comes out of that, they put him in my mom's house and then just wipe their hands of it. They don't have to worry about where he's at and whether he's getting care.
Once he's out of their hands, they're done. And unfortunately in the hospital system, there's literally in the ERs there's that phrase, treat them and street them.
Yep.
And it's because unfortunately, even though the doctors take this Hippocratic oath that says they will do no harm, that's for the patient. That's not necessarily about the family members or the caregivers. And I had a similar situation with my dad, after his second amputation, because was a double leg amputee when he passed, but he'd been a single leg amputee and I'd been taking care of him. But unfortunately, with all his health, he went into a skilled nursing facility after his second leg amputation, and they were training me to take him home. And I finally had to put my foot down and was like, I cannot provide the proper care for him. He needs to stay here. And he ended up staying. But that was because I was advocating for myself and fighting with, just to make sure that, they understood that I couldn't provide what he needed. And, it was a tough decision, but I feel like the doctors were kind of like, are you sure, you can take him home and you figure, but we knew we'd already gone through all of the system to try and get a social worker and a case manager to figure out if he qualified for any, financial benefits, but he didn't. So yeah, it was just, but thankfully I made the right decision. I made the right decision to fight. And cause he got another 6 years of amazing care from the staff at the facility. And I got to visit him as much as I could. And we got to build up a daughter-father relationship again, instead of a caregiver-client relationship in a way.
Right.
Which we'd been having, kind of everything was all boiled into one. And so hearing this about your mom, I'm like, oh my God, and her age, just in general, like at her age, she'd be possibly needing her own caregiver. And now she's being forced to care for somebody else and it's just, I'm like, oh my gosh, the system is so messed up. And I know, like, when we were trying to place my dad in a skilled nursing facility, like if Medicare is covering it, like they can place him within 50 miles of their residence. So I know my mom freaked out because when she saw that, she's like, oh my God, that means that they could place him in Seattle. Cause at the time we were living in Bremerton, Washington, and there were a few skilled nursing facilities in the area. But there was, but as the crow flies, 50 miles is like Seattle and northeast of there. So it was a big scare. And so, and there's, the other side of that of, skilled nursing facilities are not, nobody wants to be there. My dad didn't want to be there, but he understood why he had to be there. Sometimes he, go through the motions of it, but that's what skilled nursing facilities are for,
Right. And you have to agree to be in it. I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about there. And that's the situation with this guy, is that also he doesn't want to go into long-term care. Right. He wants to be at my mom's house. And so, like, when he was at the hospital, part of the reason they rushed to release him is he was throwing temper tantrums because he didn't get enough smoke breaks. And so they didn't want him in there in the hospital, and didn't want to be dealing with that. And, what's that going to be like when he's in a long-term care? Is he going to get to do what he wants when he wants, right? It's not set up that way, of course. And then there's the availability of beds, like the long-term care facility in their area. They don't have any beds available now.
Right.
They have to put a little bit more effort into clearing a bed or making room for him if he's in the hospital.
Yeah.
And so with him not being in the hospital, they don't have to do that. And quite frankly, what is he going to do when he can't go take his smoke break when he wants to?
My dad was a smoker. And I mean, he'd been smoking since he was a kid, like probably before it was supposed to be. And he hated it. And unfortunately, his facility had a no smoking policy completely for the residents, because they wouldn't even allow the staff to take them outside for the smoke break.
Well, there's liability.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is that I'm not completely heartless towards the people involved in this, understanding the constraints and policies they have to work under. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot, I mean, other than that one nurse saying that to my mom, that is something that was not okay. That was not okay at all. But within, I I kind of look at it through the lens of what it's like in my field. So in the mental health field, there's this thing called least restrictive alternative. And so if a mental health professional, and that's a very specific term to people who have been trained to assess others if they're a harm for themselves or someone else, and so therefore need to be placed in a bed in a mental health facility, one of the things they have to consider is, can they get them a bed? Yeah. And unfortunately, sometimes that takes precedence. That kind of lowers, like, well, this person's like right on the edge of maybe being suicidal, maybe being a risk to themselves. If there was a bed available, I would say, yes, they are a risk to themselves, but they have to weigh it. It's like, is there a bed available? Because in the mental health system, if they determine that this person needs a bed and they don't have a bed within a certain amount of time, a judge can hold that worker, that mental health professional, accountable.
Yeah.
And so they're having to weigh that. So if the healthcare system, if the medical portion of it has anything, if it operates under that kind of system at all, that's what the professionals are up against. And so I can understand that.
But still, your mom is your mom, and she's going through something that is being forced to do something she does not want to do. And it's not just, paying taxes or something. It's affecting her health. Now, how's your mom handling? Like, what? Because you said she's got her own health stuff. So right. Like, is she getting self-care time? Is she getting time to, you said she's working full time, and now she's taking care of him too. Yeah,
well, but and right around the time this was happening, I think it was him that had convinced her. Someone had convinced my mom, and she should have known better because of the field she works in. She knows some of these things, but that if she threw him out, she would go to jail because he was sick. And it's like, no, Mom, it doesn't work like that. No. But there is a process. She can't just kick him out, even though he has his own residence, because I don't know what her state's laws are, but I know where we're at now. If someone comes to stay with you, you can't just kick them out. You have to evict them.
Yeah. I think you have to have, if you live at the residence for more than 30 days, you are required to be evicted to be kicked out.
I think actually it's 14. That's why most landlords put on their leases that you can't have someone stay more than 14 days, because they know then they're liable they're the ones that have to evict that person from your home. So yeah, they don't want that. So yeah, anyway, and like I said, my mom, she works in a care facility for people who are developmentally disabled. So she doesn't want his social worker to find that out, because then they're going to think even more that she's qualified to do this. But that day that she couldn't get a hold of he was very delirious and falling and didn't know where he was at. So she was trying to get him back up to the hospital. So it was that day. She had spent all that time trying to do that and then had to work an overnight shift. So she had no sleep going into that. And so, yeah, it's, yeah. And
so then you as a daughter, how do you feel about all this? Because you're your mom's advocate.
Right. So my mom didn't want me or her one remaining sister to find out, because she knows how we are. And if I had been able to, the moment I found that out, I would have been there, but it takes time and money to get there. And I didn't have that at that time. But my thought is to go there and start rolling some heads, because even though it's a different state, the laws aren't that big a difference. And I think that I'd have had some words, and I've even considered calling Adult Protective Services to get a social worker assigned to her to see if they can be her advocate in this. And of course, I have to balance that with trying to respect what my mom wants. Like, she doesn't want me coming there to do that.
True, but I believe you can make an anonymous tip to Adult Protective Services. So, and I can't, like, yeah, I'm just like, there's so many different ways to get your mom help, and it's hard to take help because I know I struggled with that. Even like when I was going through taking care of my parents, it was hard to ask for help. It was hard to take help. But then when I got it, it was like I was grateful for the extra help. So I feel like she's just trying to go through the motions right now and just handling it, and then not really
well, yeah, there's this sense of identity too. Like it feels, if I were to put myself in my mom's shoes, saying no to a dying man feels wrong. Like
right.
that's just cruel and selfish. And I think a lot of people who end up as family caretakers end up in that situation where they feel that way. And it's really can be very, very difficult to find a way to be okay with that. That somehow there's this expectation that you must be the one to do it.
And I think I had a little bit of that when my dad I did have to make that decision, even to this day, I still feel guilty for making him stay there. But at the time I had nothing, and we ended up losing the house because I couldn't financially stay there and he couldn't live there. And because, they take all his income was going to the facility. So I couldn't stay there. So we ended up losing the house, which, at the time I'd moved out anyways to move in with Lori and to, that area and stuff. So it was a tough time. And even to this day, I wish there was a way that I could have had him come home. And even my most recent place I was living, I'm like, there were times where I considered, well, if I just rearrange the living room this way, or if I just cleaned out this bedroom, then I could have my dad come live here, and then we wouldn't have to have this, skilled nursing facility, and I could just take care of him. And I'm like, but that's the desire of my being a daughter. That wasn't thinking as a healthcare professional, so which kind of goes into our next topic of, us as healthcare providers in ways like I'm a licensed home care aide, you're a mental health counselor. Our hands are tied sometimes. There's laws that we have to follow and ways we have to do things that doesn't always, we're there to advocate for the patient, not necessarily the people around them. It's up to the patient to make those arrangements, which is unfortunate because I want to say holistic, but I don't think that's it. But looking at the whole family as a piece instead of just the one patient, because cancer affects everybody in the family, not just one person. And, as a caregiver, having to watch clients go through medical health stuff, it's like, well, I can help you here, but, in some ways you're limited. I couldn't help them with certain things because I'm not licensed to do that. I can't give them medication. They have to take it on their own. So at some point I have to say, okay, I can't help anymore. We need to get you some help that, people that can.
Right.
But again, hard because we want to be able to do it,
Right. Well, and that's a really, I think about how, we can't make people do things. Right. And even if it's for their own good, because that's a slippery slope. If we get involved in that and making someone do something that we think is in their own best interest, at what point do they lose their autonomy? Well, at what point do they lose their independence? And that's why in our field we call it the least restrictive alternative, is because it's the idea that nobody's liberty, nobody's freedom or independence should ever be taken from them now without cause. And I can think of instances in which someone desperately needed that 24-hour care from the family's point of view for their mental health stuff. But because of that LRA, they can't keep him against his will. And so then he'll show up and he will stop taking his meds, because that's another thing you can't make people do, is take meds. And then his reality starts slipping, and he shows up at families' houses and disrupts everything, and to the point of breaking in and destroying. He can't stay in a residence of his own because he destroys it when the voices start talking. And this isn't the client of mine, so I can talk about that part of it. But but mental health looks at the family like there's not really anything we can do about that. And then law enforcement has to get involved, and that sometimes escalates things. And then the family feels guilty because it's not that they view their family member as a criminal, but they have to at some point be safe and protect their property as well. And so the system is not set up to, it's not useful unless the person wants it to be useful.
Right. And in my line of work, like I said, I can't help, like, I can't make them take their medication. If they don't want to take it, I can't force them. What I can say is, I really think you should take it. I know you don't like the side effects, but it also helps with this. And I can encourage them to take it. And then if they don't, then that's my job to report it to their doctor and my supervisor to be like, okay, they're not taking their medication and this is this. And then that's, and then we have to do stuff that sometimes the patient doesn't want, but it's in the best interest of the patient to report it. Because we're mandatory reporters.
Yep.
And self-harm is equally as dangerous as harm to others.
Yep. It is a very, very fine balance, because within most of the time when you go in and you sign paperwork with your doctor, you sign paperwork saying that, and there's this patient rights part of it. And in those rights, it typically says something along the lines that as a patient, you have a say in your care. So if you don't want to do something, you don't have to do something. If you want a second opinion, you can get a second opinion. However, that being said, I know several people in our local area who have had issues with that when they try to assert their own, what they want for their care. I'm trying not to get into specifics here. Then they get cut. And they get a letter stating that they were basically belligerent, when that's not what they were doing at all. They were just advocating for themselves of what they felt should be in their care or not. And honestly, looking at the situations, I'm like, why was that a problem? So it's like, what's going on in the system that we're not seeing?
Right. Well, and yeah, there were times when, like, you have to be so careful even with their medication, like in the sense of, like, my dad was on some strong pain medication because he had neuropathy and some other issues that caused pain. And, he was abusing the medication in one way, of shape or form, but the doctor just kept giving it to him. So then my dad's like, well, if he gives it to me, I might as well just take it. I'm like, Dad, let's not do that. And, so there, I remember, times when he would, take the medication, he'd be out, and then we have to contact the doctor and be like, well, and they're like, well, he's hit his, like, because there's certain medications, like, you can only take so much within a month span. And that's why, like, they're limited, like the laws say you can only, prescribe so much. So plus medical insurance often only covers so much per month. If you have to refill early, they're like, nope, it's too early and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that. But then when you're in pain, you just want to take pain medication. So then it's like, you have to kind of have this balance. And when you're sick and having other things going on, your clarity is not always there, which is why caregivers are great. And I mean, I enjoy being a home care aide because I help give the independence to the client by being in their home, where they're comfortable. Unfortunately, at some point, some clients may need to go into a facility because they can't. And that's where our job ends. And that kind of is what happened with me before I moved, in with Lori. Was there were some questions as to whether or not one of my clients was gonna go into a facility, or so it was a tough decision to make for me to step back. But I'm like, I can't sit around and wait to you guys to decide. And I needed them to make the best decision for their parent, their family member, not what's with the client, or at the caregiver. So I feel bad in the medical field, because I know people can also like sign themselves out AMA from the hospital. And it's like, yeah, that's your right. But then it's also going to go in your records that you did go into the hospital and you did sign out AMA. And so then they're going to be even harder to treat you, because they figure, well, you're just not going to do what we tell you to do anyway. So you're just going to sign yourself out AMA. So what, so it's, you don't want to get to that point either. But I also hate how things go in your records that shouldn't go in your records. And then it hinders you for the rest of your life,
Right. Right. It feels like sometimes the healthcare providers forget that this person isn't at their best because they're sick. And then I see that a lot. Like they get blacklisted because they had an attitude with the doctor, and the doctor didn't feel like dealing with it that day. So now they're getting cut and told to go find your health care elsewhere. But insurance doesn't let you just do that.
Right.
Because you need an assigned provider.
Yeah.
And in their system, it shows this person, but now you're going to see this person and they won't cover it. I mean,
right. Or it's, you have to stay within a certain type of clinic because of the way your medical is set up. Like mine is a certain one that I can only see doctors, excuse me, within the certain family of doctors, clinicians.
Network, yeah.
So then I can't go to another company or find another doctor in another spot because they're not going to cover it. So then it's like, do I want to pay out of pocket and go see this doctor? Or do I want to just stick with this, so then it's like, what do I do? It's not the situation now. I just have to find a doctor here because I, moved, but
right.
And it just makes it so challenging. But again, if I had been like, not willing to do things my doctor said on the other side of the state, that would be in my records. So when I come here, what doctor might want to pick me up if I had done that? Right. I didn't do it, thankfully, but
right.
I was happily questioning some of the things my doctor did. And a few of the ailments she said I had, I went to a specialist and they're like, no, you don't have that. It's just this. And my doctor's like, no, I don't know about that. I'm thinking, yeah, you're just a GP. I went to a specialist. That's what they said. So I'm going to lean on their words instead of yours. But that's beside the point. And again, that isn't, I say that's beside the point, but it really isn't, because that's what it is.
Right.
Now you've got two doctors that are conflicting stories. So then what do I believe? The doctor that I've picked to choose, to help me, or the specialist who specializes in this type of field?
Right. Well, as while you're talking about it, I was thinking about one of my friends who was dealing with that, where she ended up getting blacklisted. I could go into all that, but part of the situation that occurred, they gave information to her daughter during the emergency that was not true, but the daughter took it as true because it came from the doctor. So now the daughter won't talk to the mom because she took the doctor's word. And so that's that, they ostracized her family in the process of this. And so and friends, and she had friends that were huge support for her, and then they came in to do an intervention and it wasn't even accurate. It wasn't even accurate information. And so and I don't think they didn't break HIPAA. when that happened. I mean, I think it's a fine line they walked, but because it was an emergency and the daughter I think there was like an authorization somewhere along the line that the daughter could get information before this emergency happened or something like that. I can't remember. It's been a couple years, but to this day, the daughter still rarely talked to the mom because of it. And so that's, tying back in that family piece of how the system not just affects the patient, but the family, and how the providers can't know all the ins and outs that go on in the family or in the home. And they're making these decisions without, or forcing these choices without knowing the dynamics. Right. Or sometimes even knowing the dynamics and still clearing that bed.
I was just thinking that too. The doctors, in my experience, especially with my parents, I had a couple of doctors for my mom that were really good, and my dad ended up having to go see one of them. So it was really cool because I was like, yeah, this doctor I trust. He actually asked you questions and cared about what was going on in your life, and didn't just take his 5 minutes, look you over, do his, check your lungs and check your heart, and then he's out the door. But there are a lot of doctors that do that. They're like, they don't care what's going on in your family life. And part of it is they don't want to know. But sometimes that factors into sometimes if somebody will go in with some heart issues or something, like, well, do you have stress at home? Do you have stress at work? But it's all factoring in. And when you've got somebody involved taking care of you or helping with providing care of some kind, it just changes everything. And I can remember doctors, we would go in with 3 or 4 things that we wanted to talk to them. Like, well, we can't talk to you about that because you're going to have to make another appointment for that, because today we're only scheduled to do this. And I'm like, I'm not making another trip in here with a double leg amputee to have this conversation, because it was challenging. My dad had a hard time getting in and out of the car. And I'm like, I'm not going to force him to get in the car tomorrow to do the same thing just so we can get you to talk about this topic. Let's talk about it today. Charge us for 2 appointments for all I care. Just do it,
Well, and that's the other thing too, and you talked about this a little bit ago, is that when we're put into this caregiving role as a family member, it changes our relationship with that family member.
It does.
And so that's an important factor too. Did your dad need a daughter, or did he need a caretaker? And he needed a daughter and a caretaker, but you can only be one at a time when it reaches a certain point. Now, for example, in my situation with my husband, he has cancer and he's sick, but he doesn't need 24-hour care. So I'm not having to be his caretaker. However, that being said, I'm going to throw him under the bus a little bit because it's kind of funny. In the beginning, when he was first diagnosed, one of the things that cancer care offers is counseling. And they're like, well, because it's hard when you get that diagnosis and all the things you have to change and do, counseling can be helpful, and someone who's trained in that specific kind of counseling can be very useful. So when they offered it to him, he's like, I know my wife is a therapist, but maybe I'll take a load off of her and I'll go check this out and see how it goes. And he gave the gal, he sat with her for an hour, and at the end he looked at her and he goes, you're really, really nice. And I can see that you are good at your job, but I live with a therapist. I think I'll stick with that.
Well, at least he gave it a try.
Yeah, he told me that. I'm like, yeah, but that's not how that works. But if things get to a point where you're needing a counselor, we will make that decision then, because I can't be your counselor. I can be your wife, but thankfully some of being your wife involves some of those things, so we're okay. But if it got to a point where it was having to change my role as a wife to be different than what I am as a wife, I would have to reevaluate the situation.
Right. Well, and I've had some, even living with Lori, I've had some moments where she's like, yeah, I talked with, her counselor and talked to you. And I'm like, I'm right here. What am I? Chopped liver. But again, you guys are mental health professionals as well as friends and stuff, but it's not that she doesn't want to talk to me. It's just that you guys also know her, and she can't just look, she doesn't want to put it all on me either. So it's like, I have to remember that, like, okay, Erin, you got to remember, you know, you're not just, you know, you're her friend, you're her roommate, you're her, you know, you're there, you know, you're helping her with things that nobody else is helping her with, but you don't have to be the only one shouldering it, because she has a family, and she calls it a tribe, you know, around. And it's good when there is a tribe, there is other people to step up.
And that's a huge key. That's actually a really important topic, because oftentimes what happens is someone gets wrangled into the caretaking role, who's a friend or a family. And if they're the only one getting wrangled into that role, that's huge. That's huge. There's no break. Now, if it's a tribe and everybody has their roles and their parts to play, then no one single person is having to take on all of it. Right. And that's super important. So like in the case of my mom, if he had called he has a child, an adult child. I can't remember if it's a boy or a girl, but he didn't want to burden that kid, that adult child, with this. And they live in a different state, and his sister. And so they don't even know. They don't even know he's terminally ill.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, he didn't have to be alone at any point throughout the years, even before this diagnosis. It's just that mom was doing it, so he continued. And I think one of the things that really makes me frustrated is that, so aside from the healthcare system, this is what they don't know, is that, you know, they've made promises to each other that if either one of them ever got sick, they would help each other out. I'm just telling people, don't do that. Don't do that, because just know in your head that you care about this person, you'll do what you can for them, but don't make these promises, because I've seen so many times where it's backfired, like this one has. But they made this promise, and then my mom got really, really ill with COVID. And the first thing he does is starts calling her really bad names and tells her he hopes she dies, and then leaves. Yeah, no. A year later, now he's sick.
And expecting it from her.
And her thing is, I promised. So please don't make those kind of promises, because you don't know what it means.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, and I understand when you have a marriage and the in sickness and health, but even then, in sickness and the health doesn't mean until you're dead too.
Yeah.
I honor, you know, I commend anyone who's in a family or a relationship that goes through that. But at some point, you're still allowed to say no. Lori said it last week, even regarding the podcast we talked about last time. You're still allowed to say no. Those vows are for, yeah, you're going to help them when they have the flu. That doesn't necessarily translate to they're on their dying bed and you're doing everything 24/7 and working a full-time job and taking care of this and taking care of that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
My ex's grandparents made that promise to each other. The grandmother made the grandfather promise to never put her in a nursing home. So when she got dementia, he pretty much he was put through so much that not long after she died, he died because his health was so poor. But she was doing things like he would catch her trying to drink bleach. He would catch her stripping down almost naked and walking out into blizzards. They would go out to eat and she would be fine. And then all of a sudden she would start screaming like a banshee. When people would run to help, she would tell them that he was trying to kidnap her, that she didn't know who he was.
Oh my God.
That was his life 24/7 because he made a promise to her not to put her in a nursing home. And we kept begging him like, look, it would be one thing if she was still there and making that promise and caring for her physical needs. I said, but this isn't that.
Yeah. And I'm a full advocate on, providing care for your parents. I was in a lucky situation where I was still living at home when my parents got sick kind of at the same time. And I had the opportunity to take care of them and I wasn't working at the time. But I always think, like, what if I was living across the state when they had gotten sick and I was working a full-time job or doing something where I couldn't just get away? What would I have done then? Would I have maybe dropped my life? Maybe. But I'll never know because that was not the situation I was in. And I understand that, families, if you have a family and your parent or a friend that you've agreed, promised to help take care of, gets sick and, you want to, you also have your own family and life to balance out. Some people can put that on hold and others can't.
Mm-hmm.
So
something I'm not sure if many people are aware of, but if you're that kind of caregiver where you're family caregiving, in some places there's programs called respite care.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes you can access that to get a break. But I don't know what all the hoops are. And I don't know I know that not everybody is able to access it. So I don't know what it takes to do that, but I know that a lot of areas have that.
Yeah, there's respite
available.
care. Even caregiving agencies like who I worked for, they offer respite services for people who just need an hour or two to go to a doctor's appointment, and they just pay for the wages for it, for a couple of hours. And there's a lot of, I think they call them adult day centers, kind of, or senior centers, kind of places where you can, take your person, family member or two, and you go do what you need to do and then come back and get them. So yeah, there's also, and I also want to say that there's also support groups for caregivers.
Yes.
And if you're in that situation where you're either being forced or willing to take care of someone, make sure that you take care of yourself too. And if it means going to a counselor or going to a group therapy session to talk about being a caregiver, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You need to take care of yourself. Something I wasn't really doing when I was taking care of my parents. I was just so focused on taking care of them that everything else was just kind of getting put on the wayside. Some of that I'm paying for now, but if I had the opportunity to do that over again and make the same decisions, I probably would have, because I wanted to take care of my parents for as long as I could. Right. But I also finally realized when I had to stop and say, I need help. And that's when I had to make that decision to keep my dad in the facility. So.
I know that if my mom were to, of course, we always joke when it comes to my mom, because we always say my brother is her favorite. And so he gets stuck with her in her old age, but it is the cost. That's the price he has to pay. But, joking aside, I would happily take in my mom if she needed it. Yeah. But it's with the knowledge that depending on her health and where she's at and what I'm available to do. Yeah. And I would go into it knowing that, there will be times if my mom can't be left alone, if she's in that kind of situation where she can't do any self-care whatsoever, I would have to consider what that looks like. Because, that's not only fair to me, but it's also fair to her. Like making sure she has the care she needs if that's the way the roles were. My mother-in-law lived with us until she passed away, and there were times when her care was above and beyond what we could do because my husband's sick as well. So she would have to go into a facility until they were able to stabilize her. Unfortunately, that's where she was at when she passed, is she was in a facility and they were working on stabilizing her, and then things just went south really fast. And we wish she would have been here instead, because I think that would have been best for her. But at the time, she needed that 24-hour care. And so that's where she was at, with the knowledge that, when she was stable, she would be able to come home. So.
And I also like to remind people too of skilled nursing facilities that sometimes it's not a permanent thing. Sometimes it's a couple of weeks to get yourself a little more strength. little more ability to have opportunities to do your own self-care and get around a little bit, make yourself, be able to safely get to and from the bathroom or things like that. And then you can maybe go home. Like you said, having the goal was for her to come home. So.
Yeah, because in between, she was doing most of her own self-care. I mean, she would need help with little things here and there, of course. But it wasn't anything that was major. But when it was her kidneys were failing. And so there was aspects of that were above and beyond. And we wish we would have known more about what that meant, what that can do for a person and how that does confuse them. And some of the things that we were seeing was like, oh, well, if we would have known, we could have really pushed for her to get this care over here that she was deciding not to do because she didn't understand. But we didn't know she didn't understand. So I think that's another thing too, is if you have a loved one living in your home and you are part of their caretaking team, to make sure that you have some knowledge of what it is they're dealing with, so that if you see it, you can kind of come alongside and help them out. We would have done quite a few things differently had we known that, including maybe go to some doctor's appointments with her to help her keep from getting confused as to what they were telling her.
Right.
And she would tell us and we'd be like, are you sure that's what they said?
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been, but she didn't want us to go because she didn't want us to tell on her.
Right. Well, this is a topic that we could definitely talk a lot more about, and we may come back to this so Lori has a chance to chime in on her own thoughts and experiences she's had, because she's had a caregiver for many years. But I think we'll wrap it up here. Just a friendly reminder that anything discussed in this podcast is not to be used as a diagnosis or a replacement for conversations with your own doctors, therapists, psychologists, or other medical professionals. This episode is available on YouTube and most major podcast platforms. And if you're not a subscriber, we'd love for you to be one. So don't forget to click the subscribe button to keep up with our upcoming episodes. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as Behind the Mask PC. And you can also email feedback and future episode ideas to behindthemaskpc@gmail.com. Links to myself, EJ, Lori, and T will be in the description box as well. And on behalf of the ladies and myself, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye.